hopefully we have some chance to interact through this. I can't thank you enough for being here. Thank you to Greg for introducing the introducer. Thank you, Greg. And also just for being lovely and coordinating so many logistics. And to Courtney Jones-Carney for contacting me ages ago and working through my endless questions, like, tell me more about this. And it's a fascinating invitation, right? So come and do this talk, but it's also for this extended purpose of developing these set of recommendations around this topic, and I'm all in. That sounds amazing. So I saw who preceded me. I saw that you had an organizational psychologist not too long ago. I think that's the organizational psychology and sociology have some interesting points of overlap. So there will be some. So I'm curious how if you heard that talk, what you might think of this one. But I'm just thrilled to be able to contribute to that sort of progressive learning. And so thinking about the topic in terms of institutionalizing our core values, I thought, well, all right. I love the topic. We're going to need a lot more than an hour. But I thought it's pretty rare that I get invited to talk about something that I think about a lot, but don't often get asked to talk about. And that's, quite frankly, because this one's tough. This one takes a lot of time. It's not as easy as how do you assess outcomes, which you probably already think is pretty hard. Or tell us more about equity, tell us more about any one of these pieces. This is like the whole chalupa, we might say, right? Like this is it. And you might have seen in the description that I actually got the statement wrong in the description. This is actually the quote. Oh, I guess may or may not have been said by this person, but whatever, it's still a great quote. And I can't tell you how many times in working with campuses and in being on a campus and implementing a major change strategy, how many times I've either thought about this or have explicitly said to campuses that I'm working with, just so you know, culture is going to beat strategy every single time. I'm just curious, anybody familiar with this quote before you had seen it? Okay. So it'll be interesting to think about. So I wanted to plant the seed and have you be thinking about this as we kind of go through the conversation and perhaps think about why it resonates so deeply in certain ways. So let me just say a word about culture, because this is one that in my job and for many years I've been asked to come and talk about, come and help us think about how you build a culture of assessment or a culture of inquiry or a culture of equity on campus. And I'm like, okay, well, let's back up and let's just talk about culture for a moment, because that in itself is probably an easy term to use without really breaking down what that means. And what I'll actually spend a good bit of time doing is not talking a lot about culture. I'm going to actually talk much more about the strategy piece, but I want you to know that this is the bomb in the background and really the component parts of it. So I wanted to show you this slide because if you know anything about the history of American higher education, it's kind of insane. This thing that we've built called American higher education is actually a conglomeration almost in any one campus. Sort of holds I wouldn't say it can't be the duality, right, because it's multiple parts, but kind of holds the multiple parts of actually different systems and different origins of what education looks like in the first place. So going sort of all the way back to it's like 18th century is thinking about the British Liberal Arts College. And then the rise in about the 20th century, 19th to 20th century, of the German Research University, and that sort of pulls along the American model of the liberal arts college with it to say, oh, but what happens if we begin to specialize within the research fields and go deeply into research and hone and specialize areas of knowledge and context within that research? And then in the 1860s and into the late 1890s, you get the rise of the land-grant institutions, which again sort of morphs and changes the ideas of what American higher education was for, and in fact, rooting it much more deeply in community engagement and in service to the local communities in which it's founded. One might argue that this is really where sort of civic ideals kind of rise up. But without even telling you what comprises culture, I just want you to know that in many ways, on this campus and many others, institutionalizing your core values must contend with, in fact, 3 different cultures almost all at once. And sort of how values play out in these contexts and this weird amalgamation that we have made. And I'm drawing really, I have to credit the scholars that have done this. I've drawn very heavily from David Labarie's work on a wonderful book called The Perfect Mess, which is his likening of the American higher education system. He sort of spends an entire book talking about how motley this thing is, how it should have never worked, and it has flourished. And it's more than widely respected, almost revered globally for what we have done with this kind of chaos. And also Clark Kerr's work on the multiversity is sort of an excellent background for this. But I just spent some time looking at some of this work, and I thought, I want to make sure I mention this because it solidified in my mind so many of the things that, like, why don't we talk to each other? Why does it always feel like we have different agendas? Why are we sort of feel like we're not operating quite on the same page? And part of it comes back to this. Okay, so that's just a tiny bit of history from a sociologist, so that's my only slide on that. All right, let me get a little bit more squarely in my area, which is, what's culture? How do we think about this thing that feels obviously really amorphous, completely nebulous, and hard to define? And yet, if we take certain elements of American culture, this is just an example slide, one of the things that you should know about culture is it sort of breaks down, or at least from a sociological standpoint, we would say institutionalize your core values within a culture. I'd say at least look at these 4 things. What represents your culture? How does that manifest? How does that become explicit in certain ways? So language is sometimes kind of an obvious one. I went with, you get the theme here. This should feel very American to you, right? And I'll tell you, like, Sociology 101 is asking first-year students to list all the words that we have for money. And you just, like, write them out, and there's like 50, right? And you get into all the colloquiums and all the idioms and all the little tiny words that we have that describe money, and then ask them to say how many words we have for snow, right? And then you say, oh, well, in Eskimo culture, they're like 50 words for snow because that's valued, and kind of get the point. The more we value something, the more we create language around it. And if we went deep on this, it's fascinating to find parts of things that we value and have no language for, almost none. So thinking about how language is used becomes a powerful representation of your values, right? So I assume that that's in there. I walked into this building, saw an amazing statement about the indigenous lands on which this building is built. And I was like, oh, there it is. That's an incredible statement and use of language to communicate values at this university. So symbols, right? Not a lot to say here. Instantly recognizable, instantly associative of something else. What becomes interesting in terms of symbols is the translation of them to the culture that you want to create. How do you take this, and this is especially hard in higher education, especially hard to translate concepts like equity, student learning even. How do you translate sort of complex ideas into something instantly recognizable? I love the challenge of that. I don't have very many good examples of it. but I love thinking about what that looks like. Okay, objects. So how are objects used in this context? The fact that you had the language on a building, powerful object to have placed it. Huge, big, so then this, everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? This is like when you pass a building every day and you're like, I had no idea it was there. Okay. Yeah, but the ways in which objects are used, the ways that they're created, they become social artifacts, embodiments of the culture that we live in. All right. Customs is hard. Customs was actually slightly difficult, particularly with this example. You know, there are lots of customs in American culture. I could have picked any one, but I wanted to actually do something that fit with this example. And I chose something that I have never done, but I heard it exists. I'm curious, anybody want to take a guess at what I think the custom is here? What am I going for? What's that again? Transactions, but explicitly, like when have you used Venmo? I'm curious, and has anybody used Venmo? Yeah. Okay, right. Good, excellent. There's a very interesting generational divide happening in the room right now. I just want to, you don't know, you don't see it, but I do. When do you use Venmo? To split things. You're splitting the bill when you go out with your friends. That's the custom, because you're a jerk if you don't do that. Totally normative to figure that out. So how brilliant is this to have recognized that custom and made it easier for us? Okay, because we care about money, right? Care about money. So this is what I want you to keep in the back of your heads as we go through this. And so, I want to make one other quick point. So this is, I don't know, I'll say I think it's interesting. You can decide what you think it is. I think it's interesting. I think the other thing that gets raised up about culture all the time, right, is that it doesn't change. Is that culture is highly intractable. I would beg to differ. I think you can change culture. It takes a long time. And you didn't need me to tell you that. But I would argue that it's the systematic ways in which those previous four things are built and thought about and infused over time that begin to slowly change culture. And we've seen this, obviously, in civil rights movements. I would say in small ways that you may not have noticed quite as much, but I think are equally powerful for this point. The ways in which cultures around smoking have changed. What better place to say that than medical school? The ways in which there have been powerful changes in the ways that we view smoking. This is one that we've been talking about for decades. The change in culture around drinking and driving, and how there were that's a whole case study in sort of the systematic ways in which language, customs, objects, all sorts of things were really used, in addition to laws and things like that too. But the ways in which those are real shifts in culture. Okay, picking up what I'm putting down, getting it. Okay, so I wanted to have this sort of in the back of your mind. So and certainly to plant this seed, that I absolutely think there's both an observation of the culture you have and the culture that you want in the institutionalizing of the values that you have. And so if these are the values, please tell me these are the values and I haven't gone to the wrong website. Thank you. Okay, good. So these are the values. And I thought, okay, well, here's one device for this talk, right? I take those 7 and I work through language, objects, symbols, and customs. And then I thought, that's really boring. And it becomes an exercise in creativity without what I think becomes really hard about the creative part of that process, or the doing part of that process. And that's the strategy. So I thought we could sit here and brainstorm about how we break down these 7 things into the into the elements of culture. But that's not that, and the culture will be important. It must be considered, there's no question, going back to Drucker's original quote. But the strategy to work within that is absolutely equally important. It's got to be balanced at some point. You just have to have respect for the culture at the end of the day. That's sort of what I think Drucker is getting at. You can strategize all you want, but ultimately you've got to balance the two. And so when I thought about, from my own experience working with campuses, being on a campus, what do I think we're really talking about? Not definitively. This is not a mutually exclusive list. There's going to be other things. But I think at minimum, we're talking about issues of power, voice, communication, and assessment. And yes, I do think assessment is slightly different than accountability. And I'll tell you when we get there. So what I'd actually like to do is kind of lay those out for you and then kind of come back to the culture piece. And as we go through this, I'd actually like to show you some of your data from a recent climate survey. And this is of employees. Are you familiar?
I'm sorry.
Okay. Did you do it? Is it your study? No, it's not your study unless you work for Gallup. But okay, well, one endorsement for the employee study here. These data were shared with me, and I just wanted to present them as sort of a backdrop. In part for the findings, which I'll show you, and which I think are interesting, compelling in their own right. Findings are findings. But also for thinking about how there are representations of those things, power, voice, communication, assessment, within the kinds of indexes. So just try to give you some sense of, well, how would we make evidence-based decisions around strategy? That's sort of what stood out to me. And we'll see if this works at all, but we're going to give it a go. Okay, you with me? Any questions so far? I'll just check my time. Okay. So, power. I'm very literal with PowerPoint slides. It's become a problem, actually, but very literal. Okay, so who has power? Somebody else might make this a leadership slide, which they'd be right. Leadership is hugely important in the strategy equation and how we're balancing that with culture. Hugely important. Here's my experience, though, with leadership as sort of a global kind of term, is it hides power. You can tell somebody they're a leader all day long, and if they don't feel like they have a sense of power, that's a relatively ineffective position to be in. And I can't tell you how many times I've observed people on campus and said, but you're this. Just make a decision. And they'll say, but I can't do anything. It's that person that's going to make all the decisions. So power becomes an enormously important part of how we think about leadership. And so that's why here I wanted to just say, well, what does it say if we just cut through the other stuff and just call this power? Because that's what it is. So interestingly, when I looked at the input on decision-making index, and they're indexes because there's several questions that are sort of asked for each of these things to sort of say input on decision-making, and then that's given one holistic score. So that's why it's called an index. And what I've done in many of these cases is kind of condensed the items or the individual questions, just kind of give you a flavor for what the index was. Did anybody of you fill out this? Do you remember doing or completing this study? So you weren't part of the response rate on this? So you were the selected out of this? Okay. Still a pretty good sample size. Oh, by the way, the samples are overwhelmingly from the medical college and overwhelmingly white. That was just so you know. What's that? 85% of the campus. 85% responded?
No, 85% of the campus is medical school.
Oh, in the medical school. Okay, so that makes sense. Okay, good. Thank you. So here's what the index for input looked like. Input valued and seriously considered at university and school levels. Those were broken apart. I smushed them together here. Leadership at the university and the school levels, two different questions. Provides opportunity for input through shared governance. All right, so The differences will emerge. But in how the sample responded to these questions to create the index, no differences by race, no differences by gender. I flagged these in red to remind myself to tell you that this was also the lowest means of any of the indices, the indexes. This is a consistent finding through, I don't know why I'm laughing right now, I just think it's so fun, I think it's funny. Those are employed less than 6 months, tended almost universally across all of these measures to have significantly higher scores. So you just get sort of more jaded as you work here. I don't know if that's wildly different than other places people work, but it was for sure a consistent finding on here. Okay, so that's one means of saying, all right, so what does input look like? Do people feel valued for the input that they're given? Looks relatively good. So if you were going to institutionalize core values around that power measure, one of the things that I would say, one of the things I'd recommend is some good old-fashioned advice from community organizing. I'd power map. I'd really think about power mapping. And I think it's something we almost never think about in higher education, ever. Basic community organizing principles. Where do you have axes of influence and power, and where do you have axes of support? We almost never do this as an exercise. And yet we want things all the time. We're always trying to affect change. I work in a world where we're doing general education reform all the time, trying to make major changes around implementation of high-impact practices and engaged learning pedagogies, implementing essential learning outcomes and assessment. Big things that I think absolutely get at other kinds of core values and almost never take the time to really think about how are people being engaged and what's their position on campus. What's their relative amount of helping and not helping? Now, matched with this, and I considered taking this out, but I was like, let's just go for it. I think closely coupled with this, and forgive me if you find this like maybe slightly crass, but are assets. So where in some ways are you going to match power and influence with relative amounts of associated resources and assets that go with that? So if you're going to affect change around institutional values, this becomes an important part of the equation of how we think about where power falls. Any questions on that? Okay, all right. So here's just a few questions to think about. So in thinking about how we exercise power, how we look at power on campus, a relative culture, relative to institutionalizing core values, I always think about this and certainly recommend this to campuses all the time. Who needs to be engaged? Who's your first step? Who's your first conversation? Where would that happen? What comes after that? I don't know. We almost never think about this one either. You're going to pick away at individual people on a campus to make change? When has that ever worked? That's not how you do a social movement. Social movements happen by thinking about collectives, units of change. Rarely happens at the micro individual level. So how do you think about groupings? How do you think about affinities? Departments become really important in this equation. Student groups, right? So thinking about those units of analysis, really important. Lots of meetings with no point and no foreseeable end. We need to be much better about asking people to do something and being very clear what the objectives are. Really going in and planning what the strategy is for change, okay? And communicating that to people as you go along. All right, so that's power. Voice. Now, I've already warned you about some literal. This one might slightly abstract. One of your core values is diversity. I would say this is diversity. That's a lot different than equity. It's a very different thing. Verna Myers, what does she do now? She does TED Talks. She's like a motivational speaker, former attorney. She's got this wonderful line that diversity is inviting people to a party and inclusion is making sure they dance. So diversity is one thing, and I want to show you a couple of indexes around that. But the idea of voice, and in my mind, the voice is different. It's correlated with power, sure. But I also think about voice as much more about who gets to talk in the room, much more about who's being heard. And often we equate it with power because those are the people that are shouting the loudest or get heard more often. But I think about equity in this context, and certainly in the context of voice, is thinking about whose voices are we paying attention to? Whose voices are we making sure that we need to pay attention to? And here your results get interesting. So in the inclusiveness index, which looks something like this, I've summarized: your supervisor creates an environment that is trusting and open. Organization treasures, by the way, this is the word, and I have never, I think, seen that word in a survey before. Interesting one. Treasures diverse opinions and ideas. The confident that employer does what is right with concerns about ethics and integrity, and trusts the organization to be fair to all employees. So this one has significant differences by race and gender, where Asian respondents had significantly higher rates than both black and white respondents, and white respondents higher rates than black respondents, and significant differences by gender as well. And again, I would just maybe call this the jaded measure. But in terms of how voice plays out and what that looks like, so one measure of inclusiveness and how those values are defined. Then there's this honoring diversity index as well. Am I being repetitive? Have you all seen these data before? Oh, this is fun then. Okay. I don't think they're secret. Okay, they're not secret, but this might be a more visual way, an exciting way to see them, because now they're animated. And you're welcome. Okay, so honoring diversity: staff, faculty appreciate others with a different race and ethnicity. Employees of different backgrounds interact well. Everyone's treated fairly. Making progress on diversity inclusion initiatives. Individuals' values. School department, two different ones: diversity inclusion and environment for free and open expression. This one, again, have significant differences by race here. This particularly in Asian being higher than black here, and then by gender as well. And then again, by employment. So really, in terms of evidence-based ways in which you're going about thinking about the institutionalization of values, what data can you draw upon to have informed conversations about how people are drawn into an effort? And I would tell you again, is working for a very long time in assessment and working with campuses on their assessment, the first place we almost always start is, what data do you currently have? People get plenty of surveys. So anytime you can just use the data you've already got is usually a pretty good starting point. So, a couple of wrap-up questions around the issue of voice. Who's being heard? Who needs to be heard? Right? Those are definitely two different things. And then how are people being invited to contribute to the conversation in intentional ways, authentic and intentional ways? Really important pieces of how you're building this process. Okay. So, for some reason, every time I see this slide, Whitney Houston comes to mind. That Whitney Houston song, so I'm just gonna have that back in my mind. You guys are killing me. It's late. It's late. Nobody had coffee? Okay, all right. Okay, so I had to put communication in this. because we're horrible at it. We're absolutely horrible at it. And I don't mean in sort of like conceptually, like, oh, we should communicate more. And we have plenty of meetings. I already said that we have plenty of meetings. So one would think that we would be kind of awesome at it, given all the meetings that we have. But I would invite you to consider the ways in which communication is being used. And looking at all the Venmoers in the room, I would also be thinking about how we're using it in 21st century ways, in far more effective ways, in ways that are much more relevant to different audiences and different stakeholders. So I love this index. And I was like, oh, I sort of saw the headline on it when I went to the climate survey. I was like, oh, confidence in UMB. But what's interesting about this index, and I'm not sure exactly why, well, I guess you'll get it confidence, but it's a lot about communication. Really, so if you look at the items, I mean, literally I'm communicated with, the communication I get is perfect, was one of the items. It's direct, it's open, it's honest. Those are all different questions. Feeling like you're asked for input, kept informed. Like you kind of see the trend here. It's very much about communication. Leadership, this was a sort of a funny one. Leadership makes me enthusiastic about the future. I didn't even know how to condense that. It was kind of so awkward. I just wrote the whole thing out. But leadership is respectful. Employers will do what's right, with, again, concerns about ethics or integrity, collaboration, cooperation, all good things. Great. So this one was fascinating. Asian respondents in the sample had significantly higher rates than every other racial category in terms of communication. No differences by gender, and then your employment. If you're waiting for me to like, and this is what you do about that, I have no suggestions whatsoever. But again, I do think it's important to point out where you have evidence and how you're using that and maximizing it to further conversations. Okay. So a few questions on that. So what are the modes of communication you're considering? How are you maximizing those? How are you thinking about, and this is one where I think, again, really thinking about the elements of culture. What are the ways in which there's pervasiveness in culture that makes Starbucks or any one of a number, Spotify, any one of a number of things pervasive? That's what I think about when I think about communication strategies. I think about all the confrontations, visual, auditory. What are all the ways in which we really could be? I think we wait for communication to be one big thing. Like it's a meeting, people are going to sit down, they're face to face, and they're going to talk, and that's just not going to happen. That's just unrealistic for the amount of time you have in your life. So we need to be much more creative. I think much more insidiously about how we're actually layering multiple modes of communication. The frequency with which those happen, hugely important. I think customs, the ways in which we're leveraging customs become a really important part of this conversation. And this. The idea that different audiences, different stakeholders, and how they're going to receive messages about core values, what that list looks like, and receive that in different ways. Those things are going to mean different things to different audiences and different stakeholders. How is that communicated? Okay. All right, so last one. What's the process of inquiry around any of the work that you're doing around institutionalizing core values? I think about assessment a lot. It's absolutely part of my background. I've said it a lot. Even in this conversation, I can't get very far from it ever. Because I don't know, as scholars in any field that you're in, why the improvement equation isn't part of our systematic and even systemic thinking. We are all rooted in our own cultures of inquiry within our disciplines. It's a fascinating thing that when we get to higher education and start working within bureaucracies and the institutions that we're in, that just falls away somehow. We're like, take our word for it, we're doing fine. It's gonna be all right. It's getting better. Really? What industry does that work for other than higher education? And I know it's because there's a lot of baggage and there's a lot of other things, but that's why the strategy becomes really important. So what's the inquiry here that's going on? And most importantly, I don't think it's an assessment question. I think it's a success question. How would you know? How would you begin to build benchmarks around any of those core values, really, and say, we think this is getting a little bit better? That's a tough exercise. But I think it's hugely worthwhile. So I just went by this building. I was like, oh, there it is. So cool. So Davidge Hall, right? I did my work here. So the markers of what change in become really important. Understanding baselines, taking the time to figure out what the baseline is, taking the time to define the baseline. Those are all first conversations to have. Where are we at? It's very important. And then I think this did come up in the last talk, but policies, practices, procedures. Yeah, those three things make a lot of sense to me. Those are the things that you improve. Those are the things that change. Those are the things that have influence on the metrics. They become the independent variables. So it can become the dependent variables too, I guess. But thinking about where are your baselines around these and how are you holding yourself accountable. But I would say just staking out what the success looks like around any one of those. So a few follow-up questions in terms of thinking about what assessment looks like in this equation. So what are the metrics? And I think a lot of times we sort of hold ourselves back in thinking about, so go back to the early slide with the social movements, changes around smoking and drinking and driving. It's not going to be good enough to set your metric for 1 year. That's not going to work. I mean, it will, sort of, but then what do you do at the end of the year? So it becomes a different kind of conversation to make sure that you're actually forecasting out. Even if you're not around to see how that turns out, what's the eventuality of that? But really important to have the conversation, because not all data is built the same. Some data takes longer to develop, and not all outcomes are built the same. There's short-term, intermediate, long-term outcomes. And understanding where those fall can be the difference between this wish list between good, better, and best. So the frequency with which you're understanding what gets measured, how often. And many of you use logic models in your work. I thought maybe there might be a chance of it. Okay, really, really helpful tools. I could have done the whole talk around logic models, and then I was certain I would be very excited, and you would not be. You gotta let people come to the logic model. You can't force the logic model on them. But really helpful tools in terms of strategy mapping, and particularly over like extended periods of time, because they sort of make you categorize what all the activities are and separate things into nice categories. But I had to sneak that tool in here. Okay, so I wanted to end with this. This is easily could have gone at the beginning. Easily, because it's organizational values. That's the name of the index. So this is the last index. And I think, actually, if you read the study on the climate study, I don't even know what part this falls in. I've sort of messed up the whole order to fit my needs in the presentation. But, right, could have started with this. So I think it's just these 3 questions. And I didn't really even synthesize them for you because I wanted you to see what they look like. So good understanding of organization's values. I have a good understanding of the organization's values. I strongly believe in those values. I understand how values impact my job. Awesome. So you could see, like if you were a working committee or perhaps some fellows that were building recommendations on this, you might pick up the climate study and be like, there's our guy. We're going to go with that index. See where we're at. Great. Well, I can tell you the news is pretty good. And I marked this one in red as well to remind myself to tell you this was the highest of all the indexes. And then again with the jaded thing here. Or the enthusiastic novices, right? Whatever this one represents. I put it at the end because I want it to haunt you. Does this match the other data that we've just looked at? If you looked at just this index that so seems to perfectly target your core institutional values, I would think you might sort of walk away and be like, our job is done. I think we're doing pretty good. And I would beg to differ based on the other findings. So it becomes really important to think about what the holistic approach is, not take any one measurement, any one sense of what accountability looks like or what the success measure is. This is the holy grail of most research, mixed methods, actually coming at the same question in different ways and trying to build that systematically into your process. So, I told you I'd come back to this at the end. So now if the strategy is haunting you a little bit, how will you think about language and how you're doing this work? How will you think about objects and their use? This is if you're thinking like, whose door is that? It's not. It's not one of your doors, but it is a door. And it's a very heavy door. Actually, it looks like something from an insane asylum or something like that. It's crazy. This is a door to a department. And I wanted to just show you, this is a professor in that department. And I love this quote, so I just wanted you to be able to see it. Because that's actually the sense of what the object is meant to do, is to make it really visual. How will you think about symbols? I told you this one's hard, so I just grabbed the most obvious one. How will you think about customs? And I chose this picture very intentionally because how we think about gatherings, how we think about putting people in conversation with each other is really, really critical in how we're institutionalizing core values, how our mechanisms for bringing people together mirror that and reflect that, right? How those become spaces that are about inclusion and equity, and how those become spaces of actual dialogue and problem solving. So I think now, I can pause, and then we have a chance for a little bit of Q&A before we go forward. Yeah? I'm curious if, I don't know if I can put this back. There it is. If you had any reflections on, like, most of you hadn't heard this quote. I wonder now, at the end, what do you think about this? Is there any, yeah?
So we've been assessing our school's culture from the student standpoint for the last few months, and we see this 100%. The school has a strategic plan that they put out every few years, and we see that there's a whole big picture idea of how they want things to be and how they want to be implemented. But then you saw through the statistics that you presented that the actual implementation may not match up with the plan. And when you're dealing with culture, you're dealing with people, and with strategy, you're dealing with just writing in black and white a plan.
Sure. Yeah? Oh, great point.
So when I saw that, I was like, that makes exact sense about what we're experiencing and what we're trying to figure out right now.
Yep. Great point. Thank you.
Well, it seems on our website there's some information on how folks can embody the core values. But do you have specific advice for folks on how, as a student, faculty, staff member, you can see yourself in the core values and how you can incorporate them into your work?
Yeah, there's this there's this famous saying, and I need to remember who actually said it, but it's used around civic engagement work, and I think about it all the time in my own life. But the line is, I kept waiting for somebody to do something, and then I remembered I'm someone, I'm somebody. So, and yeah, sort of in a direct contradiction to my earlier point about how we need more than just individuals. At the end of the day, these are about locus of control. And I've showed you the logic model, and part of the conversation you have when you work with logic models is what's your locus of control? And inevitably, as you move towards greater layers of change, the locus of control extends out because you move beyond your individual student sphere, right? Your individual life. As a faculty member, you move beyond your individual course. As an administrator, you might move beyond your individual program. No matter what, if you want to affect larger levels of change, it necessarily requires greater levels of collaboration. Nevertheless, there still are powerful examples of how the embodiment of those values in even individualized ways can be powerful, have incredible repercussions. I've seen it in certain sort of campus reform efforts, but sort of, for example, figuring out what your locus of control is becomes really important, that's one. But, so for example, the faculty member in their course, thinking about how you're articulating things on syllabi, how learning outcomes are articulated. I would expect that if you're institutionalizing core values at this institution, I would expect to see them everywhere. I would expect to see them on syllabi. I expect to see them on banners. I would expect to see them as prominently on the walls and on buildings as I saw the statement downstairs. As students, sort of how you're holding yourselves accountable is incredibly important. How you're having those interactions with your peers. Yeah, I could go on. But even, again, that locus of control is important. So whatever clubs or student groups that you're in, how you're organizing, are you pushing back on faculty around curriculum? We just had one of our national conferences, our largest national conference a few weeks ago, and Sean Harper from the University of Southern California and their Race and Equity Center did one of the keynote talks. He's just a brilliant guy. And one of the points that he made is you have to push back on curriculum. You have to push back against the lack of diversity within curricula. And that wasn't a mandate to the students. We put far too much on students anyway. It was a shout out to the administrators and the faculty who largely comprise the audience to be really reflective on the ways in which you're building curricula and how you're presenting coursework to students. So those, but when I think about what students can say and where that voice matters, there's all sorts of different ways, but yeah.
Do we have any other questions? All right. Well, folks, if you don't have any questions, first I'd like to thank.
Happy to stick around too. So thank you. Okay.